there is a throne room in Leyndell, the royal capital, the great chamber at the heart of the city, where the Golden Order's authority was expressed in stone and gold and the weight of centuries. In that room there are thrones, one for each of the demigods who held the great rooms, seats of honor for the children and stepchildren of Marika and her consorts, the inheritors of the shattered Elden Ring's distributed power. There are no thrones for Morgott and Mohg. In a room full of seats for the demigod children of the Queen Eternal, the two who were born of her union with the first Elden Lord have no seats. The children of Marika and Godfrey, the most direct lineage, the golden inheritance in its most undiluted form, were given no place at the table. Their condition denied them the recognition that their bloodline should have guaranteed. They were born Omen, and Omen sat below, in the dark, in chains. Morgott's story is a study in what happens when love is given to something that returns nothing but rejection. He loved the Golden Order. He defended the Erdtree. He bled for Leyndell. And the system he served with his entire being had decided, before he drew his first breath, that he was an embarrassment to be hidden. Tonight we begin with what he was, what being an omen meant in the lands between, why it was considered a curse, and what it cost the two children of Marika who were born that way. What the Omen curse was. The Omen are among the lands between's most carefully documented categories of being, and the documentation reveals something important about the Golden Order's relationship to anything it could not accommodate. An Omen was born with the wrong kind of body. Horns, tails, wings, features that connected the Omen to the Crucible, the primordial state of the world that existed before the Erdtree's dominance, organized everything around its particular vision of what life should look like. The Crucible was the mixing of all natures, the commingling of what would later be separated into distinct categories: human, beast, divine. In the time before the Golden Order had imposed its structure on the lands between, the Crucible's expression in living beings was simply life in its most generative form. Under the Golden Order, this generative mixing was classified as a flaw. The Omen's horns and tails and animal features were evidence that the person carrying them had not been properly shaped by the Erdtree's grace, that something old and unruly was expressing itself in their body, something that predated the order Marika had built, and that did not fit within it. The Crucible incantations in the game document this origin. Aspects of the Crucible, the Great Tail, the Thorns, the Breath of Fire, are ancient arts that predate the Erdtree. They were considered primordial, and primordial things made the Golden Order uneasy. The Erdtree system required that everything be organized, categorized, assigned its proper place. The Crucible's expression in an Omen's body was a reminder that the world had existed before that organization, and that the organization was not as total as it claimed to be. For commoners born as Omen, the treatment was brutal. The horns were cut at birth. The cutting was intended to remove the visible evidence of the curse, but the law preserves what this actually meant. It usually resulted in death. Removing an Omen's horns was removing something that had grown from the body itself, that was connected to blood and tissue and life in ways that a simple cutting could not address without consequences. Most Omen born to ordinary families in the lands between died in infancy, killed by the treatment that was supposed to save them from a life marked by the curse. Those who survived the cutting lived without their horns, but also, often, without a place in the world that had done this to them. They were known. The treatment itself had publicized what they were. the social categories that the Golden Order maintained were rigid enough that being an omen, even a dehorned one, carried permanent stigma. For the nobility, the treatment differed. Omen born to families with standing were not subjected to the cutting. The horns were permitted to remain, partly because the cutting's mortality rate made it an unacceptable gamble for families who had standing to preserve, and partly because the visibility of the nobility's omen children was, paradoxically, a greater embarrassment than their survival. What was done instead was imprisonment. Omen of noble birth was sent to the subterranean Shunning-Grounds, the vast network of spaces beneath Leyndell that the city had built over, that most of its population did not know existed, that served as the depository for everything the Golden Order found inconvenient to acknowledge. The nobility's omen children were kept alive, which meant they were kept somewhere, and the somewhere was underground. This was the framework that Morgott and Mohg were born into. The children of Golden Curse, Marika the Eternal and Godfrey the first Elden Lord, the founding couple of the Golden Order's most powerful generation, the union that had produced Godwyn the Golden, the beloved first son, and the Omen twins, the children no one spoke of. Morgott and Mohg were born as the Golden Order's most complete failure of its own promises. If the Erdtree's grace was real, if the divine favor that Marika governed was genuine, then what did it mean that the children of the Queen Eternal and the first Elden Lord were born Omen? The Golden Order claimed that Omen were cursed for lacking grace, but these were the children of grace itself. If grace had produced this, what did grace mean? The Golden Order did not engage with this question. It answered the question by not answering it, by treating the twins' existence as an embarrassment to be managed rather than a theological problem to be addressed. The children were placed in the Shunning-Grounds. The official record treated them as if they did not exist. The Golden Order's institutions continued to preach the relationship between grace and worth without acknowledging that its own foundational family had produced children who contradicted the premise. This was the world that Morgott grew up in, underground, chained, surrounded by the evidence that the system above him found his existence shameful. The city of Leyndell above was organized around the worship of the Erdtree, around the Golden Order's theological claims about grace and worth, and the proper hierarchy of being. And below it, in chains, were the children of the people at the top of that hierarchy. His horns remained. For the children of royalty, the cutting was not done. And so Morgott grew into his omen nature with the full visual expression of what the curse produced. The great curved horns, the physical reality of the crucible's expression in his body, visible to anyone who saw him for what he was. His body was capable. The Omen were, in terms of raw physical capability, superior to ordinary humans. The crucible's generative nature expressed itself in strength and endurance that the normalized human body did not achieve. Morgott was powerful, extraordinarily so, even by the standards of a demigod. The curse that made him unacceptable was also the thing that made him exceptional. What he found in the dark. The subterranean Shunning-Grounds were not empty. Below Leyndell, in the spaces the city had been built over, there was an ecosystem of things the Golden Order had decided not to look at directly. Other Omen, the mad, the monstrous, the categories of being that did not fit the structure above. Morgott grew in this environment. He developed the self-understanding that the underground produced, the awareness of what he was, what had been done to him, what the world above thought of him, and why. The law does not give us detailed accounts of his early life in the Shunning-Grounds. but the person he became is evidence of what he absorbed there. He absorbed the theology. Somewhere in the years underground, Morgott developed a relationship to the Erdtree and the Golden Order that defied the obvious interpretation of his situation. The obvious interpretation was that the system had wronged him. The obvious response was bitterness or rebellion, or the embrace of the Omen identity that the system found shameful. His twin brother Mohg would eventually find that response. Mohg would go down into the dark of the Shunning-Grounds and keep going, deeper, into the place where an outer god waited, and find in that darkness a different kind of devotion than the one above had denied him. Morgott went the other direction. He chose the Erdtree. This choice, its origin, its logic, the emotional and theological process that produced it, is one of Elden Ring's most carefully preserved mysteries. The game does not explain how a child imprisoned by the Golden Order for the crime of his birth came to dedicate his life to the Golden Order's defense. It shows the outcome and trusts the player to understand that something profound had occurred between the birth and the dedication. The most supported reading. Morgott looked at what the Erdtree represented, not what the Golden Order had done with it, but what the Erdtree itself was, and found it worth defending. The Golden Order was a human institution, built around the Erdtree by people who had used it for their own purposes. The Erdtree itself was something else. It was the organizing principle of the lands between spiritual life, the structure through which souls returned and through which the cycle of existence was maintained. Morgott could separate the institution from the thing the institution had been built around. He loved the thing. He served it despite the institution. The sealed curse. At some point, the law does not give a precise timeline. Morgott found a way to manage what he was. He sealed his curse. The omen nature was not simply a cosmetic condition. The horns were the visible expression of something deeper. The blood that ran through Omen was different, connected to the crucible in ways that produced power alongside the physical features the Golden Order found unacceptable. The power was real. It was also the thing that made Omen recognizable, that marked them as what they were. Morgott concealed it. He developed a technique, or found one, or was given one, or discovered it through whatever process of study and desperation an imprisoned demigod with nothing but time might engage in. To seal the curse's expression within himself, he locked his omen nature away inside a blade, a curved weapon of shimming, warped appearance that he kept hidden within a wooden staff he carried. The concealment was not erasure. He was still Omen. The horns were still there. The blood was still different. The capacity for the crucible's power remained within him. What he had done was find a way to present the version of himself that the Golden Order required, to appear, when he chose to, as something closer to the normalized human form that the world above valued. This was the foundation of the double life he would build. A man who could be two things simultaneously. The thing he was born as, locked away and hidden, and the thing he had chosen to become, presented to the world as his public face. The two identities. When the shattering came, when Marika broke the Elden Ring, and the wars of the demigods began, and Leyndell found itself contested by forces from within and without, Morgott broke free from the Shunning-Grounds. He had been imprisoned for the crime of his birth. The imprisonment ended not through pardon or acknowledgement, but through the chaos the shattering produced in the city above. The systems that had maintained the underground's containment were disrupted. The city was in crisis. Morgott emerged. He found Leyndell without a ruler. The Golden Order's governance had collapsed along with the Elden Ring's integrity. The city that had imprisoned him needed someone to defend it. and no one from the recognized hierarchy was present to do so. Godwyn was dead. The demigod wars were pulling the recognized claimants in different directions. Leyndell, the center of the Golden Order's authority, was undefended. Morgott defended it. He became the veiled monarch, the shrouded lord, ruling Leyndell from the throne that had no seat for him, governing the city that had kept him underground, defending the Erdtree that the institution protecting it had decided he was unworthy to approach. He did this while concealing his Omen nature from the people he was governing, because they were the descendants of the people who had put him underground, and the revelation of what he was would have complicated the governance he was providing. He created Margit, the fell omen, the persona that the game introduces as its first major boss, the figure players encounter long before they reach Leyndell, and long before the name Morgott means anything to them. Margit was the public face he deployed when he needed to operate outside Leyndell in the field, hunting champions and tarnished who grew too ambitious. The figure with the gnarled staff and the golden swords and the ancient, weathered appearance was a disguise, a way for the Omen King to act in the world without revealing himself as the ruler of the city he was supposedly protecting from external threats. He founded the Knights' Cavalry, the order of knights who rode out at night across the lands between, hunting those who had grown too powerful, driving back the ambitious. They were Morgott's instrument, an extension of his will operating in the darkness where an omen could move without the world seeing what was moving. He was governing an empire, fighting its wars, managing its enemies, and doing all of it while being the thing the empire had decided was an embarrassment. The irony was total, and he appears to have been completely at peace with it. What his great rune proved. When the shattering distributed the Elden Ring's power into great runes, and the demigods claimed them, Morgott claimed one. His great rune is described as the anchor ring, the base, the foundation of the Elden Ring structure. The item description preserves what the great rune proved, that the Omen King was born of the golden lineage, and that he was indeed the Lord of Leyndell. These two facts are preserved together because they needed to be established together. The golden lineage part, the direct descent from Marika and Godfrey, had been denied in practice by everything the Golden Order had done to him. The Lord of Leyndell part had been denied by the absence of a throne for him in the room full of thrones. The great rune proved both simultaneously. The divine instrument itself, the shattered piece of the Elden Ring's governing authority, recognized what the Golden Order's institutions had refused to recognize. Morgott's blood was golden. Morgott was Leyndell's ruler. The great rune said so, in the language of the divine, that the Golden Order had built its entire theological framework around. He held the anchor. Of all the great runes distributed by the shattering, his was the base, the ring that housed the foundation. The demigod that the system had most comprehensively rejected held the piece of the shattered divine that everything else depended on. The theology was evident to anyone who looked at it clearly. The Golden Order had been wrong about Morgott from the beginning. The divine instrument knew what the institution had refused to know. Sleep well. 7 more parts remain, and the Tarnished is approaching Leyndell. 2 children were born into the same darkness. They shared the same parents, the same horns, the same underground prison, the same theological rejection by the system their parents had built. They grew up in the same subterranean Shunning-Grounds, surrounded by the same evidence that the world above had decided their existence was an inconvenience. They chose completely different responses to this. Morgott chose the Erdtree. Mohg chose the blood. One brother spent his life defending the system that imprisoned him. The other spent his life building an alternative to it. Understanding both choices, why each twin arrived at such a different destination from the same starting point, is essential to understanding what Elden Ring is saying about the Omen, about the Golden Order, and about what people do when the world they were born into decides they are unwelcome. Tonight, we follow both brothers. Mohg first, to understand what Morgott chose against, and then the deeper territory of Morgott's choice. What it meant to love something that had wronged you so thoroughly, and what it cost him to maintain that love across his entire life. What Mohg found. Mohg went deeper. When the underground failed to give him what he needed, when the Shunning-Grounds population of rejected and imprisoned beings offered nothing that could accommodate what he was looking for, he descended further into the place below Leyndell, the Formless Mother, the outer god of blood who waited in the deepest parts of the underground, in the space that the Subterranean Shunning-Grounds themselves sat above, a divine presence that was entirely outside the Golden Order's framework, not part of the Erdtree's system, not subject to the Greater Will's authority, something that had its own relationship to existence and its own form of power, and its own willingness to extend that power to those who came to it. The Formless Mother took Mohg's accursed blood and ignited it, the blood that the Golden Order had classified as a curse, the Omen blood, the crucible expression that the system above found unacceptable, was, from the Formless Mother's perspective, something entirely different. It was fuel. It was potential. It was the raw material of a kind of power that the Erdtree's grace had never offered and would never offer. Mohg became the Lord of Blood, of the sorcery he developed. Blood Flame, the combination of his Omen blood and the Formless Mother's gift, was among the most powerful and most distinctive in the lands between. The wings that his Omen nature had always given him took on new significance in the context of his blood devotion. He built a dynasty, the Mohgwyn dynasty, the underground palace that Mohg constructed in the deep place where he had found the Formless Mother. A space of dark beauty, of blood flame and offering, of a theological framework that had replaced the Golden Order's entire structure with something of his own making. The dynasty was built around blood as a sacred substance, around the outer god he served as the divine authority, around Mohg himself as the Lord who had found power in the thing the world above had told him was his shame. He also took Miquella. This is the act that made Mohg a figure of genuine horror rather than simply a figure of tragedy. He kidnapped his half-brother, the Empyrean, who had been developing the Erdtree, who had been working to create a divine authority that extended grace to those the Erdtree had excluded. Mohg wanted Miquella as his consort in the dynasty he was building. He saw in the sleeping Empyrean someone who could be made divine in a new way, someone whose power could anchor the Mohgwyn dynasty as something permanent rather than simply an act of defiance. What Miquella wanted was irrelevant to Mohg's plan. The lore is clear on this. Miquella was taken, was put to sleep, was being held in the Mohgwyn palace cocoon, while Mohg's blood flame ritual attempted to do something to the Empyrean's nature that Miquella had not consented to. It was the most intimate possible violation of someone whose life had been organized around creating sanctuary for the excluded. Mohg's response to being excluded was to build something that then excluded others. This is what Morgott chose against. He watched what his brother became. Or perhaps he did not watch directly, given the separation their different paths produced. But he knew, in the way that the lands between demigods knew the broad shape of each other's choices, what Mohg had found in the dark, and what he had built with it. What Morgott chose. The contrast between the brothers is not simply one of loyalty versus rebellion, or acceptance versus rage. Mohg's rage was understandable. The system had wronged them both. The theology that classified their blood as accursed was the same theology that gave Godwyn the Golden Throne and gave them a dungeon. What Morgott found in his years underground was a way to separate the Golden Order as an institution from what it claimed to represent. The Golden Order had failed him. The Erdtree, the actual divine presence, the thing the Golden Order had organized itself around, had not made a decision about him. The Erdtree received souls. It maintained the cycle. It was the structure of the world's spiritual life. It had not sent his mother a message saying that her Omen children should be hidden away. People had done that. The human and demigod institutions of the Golden Order had done that. The interpretation of the Erdtree's grace as something that could be withheld from Omen. That was a theological choice made by people who found the Omen's existence inconvenient and used theology to manage their discomfort. Morgott, in his chains, made a different theological choice. He decided that the grace was real even if the institution had failed to extend it to him. He decided that the Erdtree was worth defending even if the defenders had wronged him. He decided that his love for what the Golden Order claimed to represent was not cancelled by the Golden Order's failure to live up to its own claims. This is either the most profound spiritual achievement in Elden Ring's cast, the ability to love a thing beyond the failures of its human vessel, or it is the saddest expression of self-denial in the game's world. The lore holds both possibilities without resolving them. What it does not hold is the interpretation that Morgott's choice was naive. He was not defending the Golden Order because he did not understand what it had done to him. He understood perfectly. He had lived the consequence of the institutional failure for his entire life. The choice to defend the Erdtree anyway was made with full knowledge of what the defense would cost him and what he would receive in return, which was nothing. He would receive nothing. The Erdtree would not acknowledge him. The institution would not change. The thorns around the Erdtree that ultimately barred the path to becoming Elden Lord, those thorns barred him too. He had defended Leyndell, defended the Erdtree, held the city against every threat the shattering produced, and when he was defeated, and when he told the Tarnished what they would find when they reached the Erdtree, what he told them was, "We are all forsaken." He included himself in the forsaken. The man who had dedicated everything to the defense of the Golden Order knew, by the end, that the dedication had not purchased what he had hoped it might. The double life's cost. The Margit persona required Morgott to deny himself in public. Every time he operated as Margit, every time he deployed the disguised identity to hunt champions and drive back the ambitious, he was presenting a version of himself that concealed the central truth of what he was. He was hiding his horns. He was hiding his nature. He was performing the Golden Order's rejection of Omen identity, even while being an Omen himself. The self-concealment was practical. He understood that revealing himself as an Omen to the people of Leyndell would undermine the governance he was providing. The Golden Order's theological framework had been absorbed by the population over generations. They had been taught to understand Omen as cursed, as lesser, as evidence of divine disfavor. Morgott governing them openly as an Omen would have destabilized the very institution he was trying to protect. So he hid. He governed from behind the veiled monarch's identity. He fought from behind Margit's face. He protected people who would have rejected him if they had known what was protecting them. The loneliness of this is immense. Ruling a city that cannot know you rule it. Defending a people whose theology classifies your existence as a curse. fighting wars for a cause that has not made room for you in the throne room. Morgott did all of this for what appears to have been an extended period, from the early days of the Shattering, when he broke from the Shunning-Grounds and found Leyndell without a ruler, through the years of the demigod wars when the city was contested from multiple directions, to the period of the main game when the Tarnished began to arrive. He was alone in the way that only someone with two identities can be alone. The person who knows what they are has no one to show it to, and the person who shows their face to the world is showing a face that is not quite real. The Knights Cavalry and their function. The order Morgott founded operated at night. This was not accidental. The Golden Order's world was organized around the Erdtree's light. Grace manifested as gold. Divine favor expressed as luminescence. The proper order of things associated with the warmth and visibility of day. Night was the space where things the Golden Order preferred not to see could move. An Omen who had spent his life in the underground, who governed from behind a concealed identity, who had chosen to love a system that had imprisoned him in the dark. His army rode at night. The Knights Cavalry were the extension of Morgott's will into the lands between's geography, and they operated in the hours when the Golden Order's light did not reach. What they did, they hunted champions. They drove back ambitious warriors who grew powerful enough to threaten the Erdtree's stability. They maintained the status quo of a Shattering-era lands between, in which the Erdtree still stood, and no claimant had yet succeeded in becoming Elden Lord. This was the practical expression of Morgott's dedication. Keeping the path to the Erdtree defended, keeping the city that housed the Erdtree functional, keeping the world from fracturing further than it had already fractured. They did this without anyone knowing who had sent them. The Knights Cavalry served the Veiled Monarch, and the Veiled Monarch was an identity that pointed at nothing anyone could confirm. The city's population benefited from their protection, without knowing the nature of the protection or its source. The armor sets associated with Knights Cavalry, found throughout the lands, between carry item descriptions that document what they were. The order that Morgott created to preserve the Golden Order's stability, operating in the dark, serving a ruler who could not show his face. Their existence across the game's world is evidence of how far Morgott's influence extended, even while his identity remained concealed. What the Shunning-Grounds still held. Beneath Leyndell, even in the period when Morgott was governing the city above, the Subterranean Shunning-Grounds continued to exist. Other Omen remained there. The system that had placed Morgott and Mohg underground had not changed, because Morgott had escaped it and chosen to defend it. The institutional structure, the theology that classified Omen as cursed, the practice of imprisoning noble-born Omen, continued to operate beneath the city that Morgott was protecting. He was defending a city that was, at the same time, keeping other Omen imprisoned in its foundations. The people he was protecting above were the descendants of the people who had put him below. The theological framework he was serving was still producing Omen children who were being sent underground. Whether Morgott ever engaged with this directly, whether he thought about what the defense of Leyndell meant for the Omens still in the Shunning-Grounds, whether he tried to change anything about the system while governing it, whether he simply accepted this as part of the world structure, the way he had accepted his own imprisonment, the law does not say. The silence on this point is itself significant. Morgott, who had escaped the underground and chosen to defend the world above, apparently did not use his position as Leyndell's Veiled Monarch to address the thing that had wronged him. The institution continued. The Shunning-Grounds continued. the new Omen continued to be sent below. His love for the Erdtree did not translate into reforming the human institution that had built itself around the Erdtree. It translated into defending that institution as it was, flaws included, because the thing worth defending was underneath the flaws, and the flaws were not his to address, or he lacked the power to address them, even from the throne. A ruler who cannot reveal himself as Omen to his own subjects cannot easily argue for Omen rights without undermining the disguise that makes his governance possible. The double life constrained him even in power. The waiting. The shattering had not produced a new Elden Lord. The demigod wars had been fought, and none of the contestants had succeeded. The Erdtree was still there. Leyndell was still there. Morgott was still there, ruling from behind his concealed identity, waiting for whatever came next. He had been watching the pattern of the Tarnished's return. The grace had been extended to the Tarnished. The exiled warriors that Marika had promised to call back after death, a category of the graceless who had been given a path back to the lands between. They were coming, more of them all the time, drawn by the grace that still flickered in the world even after the shattering, moving through the lands between toward whatever goal the grace was guiding them toward. Some of them were heading for Leyndell. Some were accumulating the power that the path to the Erdtree required, defeating demigods, claiming great runes, building toward the confrontation that access to the Golden Order's heart demanded. Morgott deployed Margit to meet them. The fell Omen, waiting on the bridge. The game's introduction of the character as a gatekeeper, as an obstacle, as the figure who stood between the Tarnished and the ambition the Grace had called them to pursue. Margit's function was to turn back those who were not ready, to test those who claimed readiness, to maintain the filtering system that Morgott had built around access to Leyndell and the Erdtree. The Tarnished, who would eventually reach the throne room, had passed Margit's test, had passed every test, had accumulated the power that the path required. When the Tarnished finally arrived at the Elden Throne, Morgott was waiting without his disguise. Sleep well. 6 more parts remain, and the Tarnished is at the gates. The shattering produced chaos across the lands between. When Marika broke the Elden Ring and the great runes scattered into the hands of the demigods, the war that followed was among the most destructive events in the world's history. The demigods, who had gathered the fragments of divine authority, fought each other for supremacy. Radahn held the stars with his gravitational power. Rykard consumed a god in the volcano. Malenia and Radahn met at Ionia and devastated an entire region in the bloom that followed. The Golden Order as a functioning governance structure ceased to exist. The framework that had organized the lands between for the duration of Marika's divine reign collapsed. Leyndell was contested. The capital that stood at the center of the Golden Order's world, the city built around the Erdtree, housing the Elden Throne, the seat of authority that every demigod with ambition was ultimately trying to reach, became a target. The Shattering's wars were not simply fought in the margins of the lands between. They were fought toward the center, toward the place that holding would mean the most. Morgott defended it, alone essentially, with the Knights' Cavalry he had founded, with whatever forces had remained loyal in the chaos of the Shattering's aftermath, with his own body as the most reliable weapon available. He held Leyndell against every challenger who came for it. The scope of what he held. To understand what Morgott's defense of Leyndell meant, the scale of what he was holding against needs to be understood in full. The Shattering Wars involved the most powerful beings in the lands between. Radahn alone, the Star Scourge, the demigod who had mastered gravitational sorcery and whose physical size exceeded that of any other demigod, had held the stars in place against his own weight of purpose. Rykard had consumed the serpent god of Volcano Manor and gained an immortality that made conventional combat irrelevant. Malenia was the finest warrior in the lands between, whose lifesteal mechanic meant that every wound she received could be taken back from whoever had given it. These were the beings contesting the Shattering's aftermath. None of them held Leyndell. Morgott did. The wars did not conclude with any of the demigods succeeding in taking the capital. The thorns of the Erdtree eventually blocked the path upward to the divine seat, the Erdtree itself sealing off access to the Elden Ring in a way that prevented any claimant from reaching what becoming Elden Lord would have required. But in the period before the Thorns, in the period when the wars were active and the Erdtree had not yet closed itself off, Morgott was the obstacle between the contesting demigods and the throne they were fighting toward. He fought his siblings and half-siblings, the people he had never been given a seat beside in the throne room. Godric, the distant relation who had claimed a great rune through grafting other warriors' limbs to himself. The forces associated with Rykard's Volcano Manor that sent assassins into the world. Whatever pressure each contesting faction put on the capital, Morgott met it. His double identity served him here. Morgott ruled Leyndell from concealment, and Margit operated in the field, and together the two faces of the same being created the impression of a defended city, with a functioning hierarchy, when the reality was one Omen demigod, running everything simultaneously. The people who served the Veiled Monarch did not know that the fell Omen was the same being. The people who encountered Margit did not know they were encountering the ruler of Leyndell. The concealment was part of the defense. It prevented the enemies of the city from understanding the full shape of what they were opposing. The wounds he carried. The fights took a toll. Morgott was powerful. His Omen nature gave him physical capability that exceeded ordinary demigod standards, and his mastery of his sealed curse gave him access to the crucible powers that the Omen blood carried. But he was fighting sustained wars over an extended period without the recovery time that peace would have allowed. The sealed curse was also a continuous drain. The warped blade inside the wooden staff, the locked-away Omen nature, maintaining that concealment required ongoing effort. Every time he fought as Morgott, unleashing the full expression of what he was, there was a cost to the recontainment afterward. The law preserves this through the boss fight itself. When Morgott's health falls below 50%, he removes the binding on his curse and fights with his full nature expressed, unleashing the golden blood that the seal had been keeping contained. He feels unbearable shame in doing so. He feels shame for being what he is, in the middle of a fight he is having on behalf of what he is being shamed by. The layers of this are not subtle. The Omen King, who loves the Erdtree, releases his Omen nature with shame because the Erdtree's institutional framework has taught him to feel shame for what the Erdtree's own divine lineage produced in him. The Thorns came. At some point in the period of the Shattering's wars, after the demigods had been unable to claim the throne, after the wars had exhausted themselves without resolution, the Erdtree sealed. The thorns emerged from the ground around it, the golden brambles that blocked all access to the Erdtree's interior, that turned back every attempt to approach the divine source that the Golden Order had been organized around. Morgott had been defending access to a path that then closed itself. He had held the city for the Erdtree, and the Erdtree had closed. He had protected the approach to becoming Elden Lord, and becoming Elden Lord had become impossible. The thorns barred him too. He tried to approach the Erdtree himself. The law is clear on this, that he attempted to make his way past the thorns as every other claimant had attempted. The Erdtree, that his entire life had been organized around defending, rejected him the same way it rejected everyone else. His dedication did not purchase an exception. He was all forsaken, he would eventually say, and he included himself when he said it. The Margit encounters. The Tarnished who came to the lands. Between through the Call of Grace encountered Margit before they encountered Morgott. This was deliberate. The structure Morgott had built around Leyndell's approach placed the fell Omen persona as the first gatekeeper, the being who would assess whether the Tarnished pressing toward the capital were powerful enough to be worth engaging with at the throne level. Margit on the bridge to Stormveil. The location was chosen with tactical understanding. The approach to Stormveil Castle, which was itself the approach to the first major great rune that the Tarnished needed, was the point at which many ambitious claimants could be turned back early. Margit's presence there filtered the Tarnished who were not ready, sparing Leyndell the burden of engaging with every early-stage claimant who might otherwise have pushed through before building sufficient power. The dialogue Margit used told the Tarnished something important about the framework Morgott was operating within. He called them fool. He called them lowly. He described the pursuit of the Elden Ring as brash ambition, as the kind of grasping that the Golden Order's framework classified as overreach. He was enforcing the Golden Order's hierarchy even while being excluded from it. The Omen, who had spent his life being told he was beneath the Golden Order, was now telling others they were beneath it too. Whether he believed this, or whether the enforcement was purely functional, a way to maintain the stability of the institution without personal investment in its hierarchy, the law does not fully clarify. What is visible is that Morgott adopted the language of the Golden Order's hierarchy as his own, at least in the public face he presented. The Tarnished, who defeated Margit, pressed on toward Stormveil, toward the Great Rune, toward the accumulation of power that would eventually bring them to Leyndell's gate, and then to the Elden Throne, where Morgott waited without disguise. What Godric represented, Stormveil Castle, which Margit was guarding the approach to, was held by Godric the Grafted, the last of the golden lineage, the distant descendant of Godwyn, whose inheritance had diluted so thoroughly across the generations that grafting the limbs of defeated enemies onto his own body was the method he had found to compensate for what the bloodline had become. Godric was everything the Golden Order's promise of grace had produced in its most degraded form. The lineage that had been most golden had thinned to someone who stole others' bodies because his own was insufficient. His grafted form was the physical expression of what happened when the claims of divine inheritance outlasted the substance of what was inherited. Morgott was everything the Golden Order's condemnation of Omen had produced in its most absurd form. The lineage that the Golden Order had condemned was the same lineage, the children of Marika and Godfrey, and it had produced both the grafted Lord of Stormveil and the Omen King of Leyndell simultaneously. The Golden Order had elevated Godric's line while condemning Morgott's nature, and the outcome was Godric's grotesque impotence and Morgott's extraordinary capability defending the same institution that had created this disparity. The Theology of Grace, examined at the level of what it had produced in practice, was a study in incoherence. Morgott's Great Rune was the anchor. Godric's Great Rune was described as a thin and lightweight thing, the fragment of divine authority that had fallen to a fragment of the golden lineage, small in proportion to what the lineage had become. The institution's theology and the divine instrument's distribution, told very different stories about worth and grace. The second Margit encounter. After Godric was defeated and the first great rune was claimed, Morgott deployed Margit again, this time not as a gatekeeper to turn the Tarnished back, but as a more serious assessment of what they had become. The second Margit encounter, available to those who sought it, was more demanding than the first. The fell Omen, who had been testing the Tarnished's readiness earlier, was now engaging with someone who had actually accumulated significant power. The assessment required more of Margit, because the Tarnished required more of Margit. This pattern, the escalating challenge, as the Tarnished proved themselves worthy of escalating challenge, was Morgott's management of the approach to the throne. He was not trying to destroy the Tarnished. He was trying to ensure that whoever reached the Elden Throne was genuinely powerful enough for whatever came after. The Grace had called them. Morgott was doing the filtering, but the Grace's call did not itself perform. There is something almost paternal in this, under the surface of the hostility. The fell Omen who called the Tarnished fool and lowly was also the being who was testing them against standards that, if met, would bring them closer to the goal the Grace had pointed toward. Morgott held the door. He tested those who wanted to pass. He stepped aside for those who proved themselves ready. He had no throne in the room they were trying to reach. He held the door to it anyway. The weight of solitude. Across the years of the Shattering's aftermath, Morgott's governance of Leyndell was an act of solitary dedication on a scale that most beings could not have sustained. He was the only coherent governing authority in the city. The other demigods who might have shared the burden of administration had their own territories and their own wars. The Golden Order's institutional structure had collapsed with the Shattering. The churches and the minor lords and the various officials who had functioned within the pre-Shattering governance were still there, but the authority that had organized them was gone, and Morgott's concealed identity meant that his replacement of that authority was never publicly acknowledged. He could not acknowledge himself. The Veiled Monarch was a functional identity, not a revealed one. He gave orders through intermediaries, maintained governance through systems that had been established before the Shattering, and that he was now operating through his hidden authority, managed the city's defense without the city understanding who was managing it. The loneliness of this was structural as much as personal. He was surrounded by people he was protecting without their knowledge. He was governing a city whose theology classified him as cursed. He was defending an institution that had decided, before his birth, that he was an embarrassment. He did it anyway, for years, for the entire duration of the Shattering's age, until the Tarnished that the Grace had finally produced strong enough to challenge him at the throne arrived, and the long defense came to its conclusion. Sleep well. 5 more parts remain, and the Tarnished has finally reached Leyndell. The Tarnished arrived in Leyndell, the path that Morgott had built barriers along, the bridge where Margit first appeared, the approach through Stormvale, the accumulation of great runes, the long road through the lands between that the Grace had marked, ended at the Golden City. Leyndell was extraordinary. Even in the Shattering's aftermath, even with the wars having pressed against it, and the governance having been reduced to Morgott's hidden hand, the capital retained the aesthetic achievement of centuries of the Golden Order at its height. The architecture was immense. The scale of buildings designed for a civilization that believed in the Erdtree's permanence, that had built for a future it expected, would be organized around divine grace indefinitely. The golden coloring, the enormous statues, the coffins embedded in the city's walls in the tradition of Erdtree burial, the arrangement of districts radiating outward from the great tree at the centre. All of it remained. The Tarnished moved through it toward the throne. The path to the Elden Throne passed through Leyndell's outer districts, through the Altus Plateau approaches, through the avenue of the capital itself. The city's ordinary population, the knights and the soldiers and the citizens who had remained through the Shattering's chaos, encountered the Tarnished as an intruder, as a challenger, as the kind of ambitious claimant that the Knights' Cavalry had been founded to push back. They fought. Morgott's defense of Leyndell was not passive. The city's forces engaged every Tarnished who came too far. The Golden Order's remnant military, operating under the authority of the Veiled Monarch, they could not see, and had not been told was an omen, pushed back against the assault. They died. The Tarnished, who had accumulated enough power to reach the throne, had accumulated enough power to push through the defense. Morgott let them reach the throne room. He could have deployed Margit again, could have sent his disguised self to intercept the Tarnished at some earlier point in the approach. He chose to wait. The Tarnished who had come this far had proven themselves through every encounter along the way. The final meeting warranted the real face. The throne room, the Elden Throne Chamber, the heart of Leyndell's governance, the room that the Golden Order's entire architectural vision had been oriented toward, where the authority of the Elden Lord had been expressed in the period before the Shattering. The thrones of the demigods arranged in the space, the absent thrones where Morgott and Mohg should have been. Morgott was there, without the Margit disguise, without the concealment of the wooden staff hiding the warped blade, without the normalized human presentation that the double identity required. He was there as what he was, the Omen King, horns and all, the demigod child of Marika and Godfrey, who had been denied a seat in this room, and who was nonetheless the one standing in it. The approach the game takes to this moment is worth examining carefully. The cutscene before the Morgott boss fight shows him in this space, surrounded by the golden light of the throne room, and the visual composition deliberately places him against the architecture of the Golden Order's most formal setting. The omen in the room built to exclude omens, the cursed child in the Chamber of Grace. He is enormous. His horns are fully visible. He belongs here, and he should not be here, and both of these things are true simultaneously. He addressed the Tarnished. His words are among the most carefully crafted in Elden Ring's dialogue, dense with the theology of the Golden Order, with the history of the Shattering, with his understanding of what the Tarnished represented and what their ambition meant. He called them willful traitors all. He grouped the Tarnished with his demigod siblings, the demigods who had contested the Shattering's aftermath, who had fought each other and sent forces against Leyndell, who had each pursued their own ambition at the cost of the stability Morgott had been maintaining. The Tarnished, in his framing, were more of the same. Another ambitious claimant pressing toward a throne that belonged to the Golden Order's divine structure, rather than to any individual capable of claiming it. He called them pillagers, emboldened by the flame of ambition. This was his theological framework for what the Tarnished were. Beings who had been exiled, who had returned through the call of grace, who now pressed toward the Elden Ring as though the Grace's call entitled them to take what they wanted. The same accusation he made against his demigod siblings, the same framework. He did not say that he himself was among the Forsaken. He did not, in the opening of the confrontation, acknowledge that the thorns had barred him too, that the Erdtree had rejected his own attempts to approach it, that his defense of the Golden Order had purchased nothing. That acknowledgement came later, at his defeat. The fight was real. Morgott fought the Tarnished with everything he had. His Omen nature fully expressed, his curse unsealed, the golden blood and the holy weapons manifested simultaneously. He summoned the arsenal of the Golden Order's sacred arms alongside the crucible power of his blood. He was the convergence point of both traditions, the holy weapons of the Erdtree's tradition, and the primordial power of the Omen blood, and he deployed both without reservation. When his health fell far enough, he released the seal. The warped blade emerged, the golden blood coursed. He felt the shame the law describes, the unbearable shame of revealing what he had spent his life concealing, and fought on. He was defeated. The words of the defeated, what Morgott said after his defeat, is the emotional center of his entire storyline. The words were not dramatic in the conventional sense. There was no villain's dying speech, no revelation of hidden plans, no theatrical final statement organized around pride or defiance. He told the Tarnished the truth. Tarnished, thou but a fool. The Erdtree wards off all who deign approach. We are all forsaken. None may claim the title of Elden Lord. And then, thy deeds shall be met with failure, just as I. The shift from the opening of the confrontation to its close is one of Elden Ring's most quietly devastating moments. He opened the fight calling the Tarnished a traitor and a pillager. He closed it, acknowledging that he himself had been met with failure, that the Erdtree had barred him as it barred everyone, that his dedication had not purchased the recognition he had built it to deserve. The inclusion of himself in the Forsaken is the key line. We are all forsaken. Not they are all forsaken. We. He included himself in the group that the Erdtree had turned away. The Omen King, who had defended the Golden Order from within the underground, who had governed Leyndell without acknowledgement, who had held the anchor Great Rune and proven his golden lineage through the divine instrument itself, acknowledged that it had not been enough. His final words were not a curse or a condemnation. They were a warning, delivered in the tone of someone who had learned what he was warning about through direct personal experience. The Tarnished who would press on toward the Erdtree would find what he had found. The thorns, the closed door, the institution whose claims of grace did not translate into the access those claims implied. He was right about this. He was right about the Erdtree being closed to conventional approach. He was right that the Tarnished's deeds would be met with obstacles. He had been there. He knew what his Great Rune contained. When Morgott was defeated, the Tarnished received his Great Rune, the anchor ring that proved two things, the golden lineage and the Lord of Leyndell. The Great Rune's power was the raising of maximum health, the increase in the Tarnished's capacity to sustain damage, to endure what the lands between brought against them. This was the practical expression of what Morgott himself had been doing, absorbing the damage that came for Leyndell, enduring what the Shattering's wars had thrown at the city, sustaining the defense through sheer capacity to take what was given. He had been the most resilient presence in the Golden Order's remnant governance. His Great Rune, activated, extended that quality to the Tarnished who had defeated him. The Omen King's inheritance was endurance, the ability to continue bearing what needed to be born. The rune also preserved his identity through its description. Even in defeat, even as a collectible item in the Tarnished's possession, the Great Rune's text insisted on both facts, the Golden Lineage and the Lord of Leyndell. The Golden Order's institutions had denied him both. The divine instrument preserved both after he was gone. The transformation after defeat. Something happened to Morgott after the Tarnished defeated him that the game depicts without full explanation, and allows the player to witness without interrupting. He diminished. The massive Omen King, the enormous demigod whose crucible-enhanced body had been fighting at the peak of its capability, became something much smaller, an enfeebled old man, barely larger than a human at ordinary scale, with the horns still present, but the body now without the divine power that had been animating it. The great rune's loss was the cause. The anchor ring, the piece of the Elden Ring that had housed his power, that had been the material expression of his divine inheritance, was gone. Without it, what remained was what he had been underneath the divine power. An omen who had spent his entire existence fighting for something that had never truly accepted him, whose body was now showing what that cost looked like when the power was stripped away. He did not die immediately. He spoke his warning. He acknowledged the forsaking, and then he was there, in the throne room, diminished, as the tarnished moved on. The law preserves what happened later. In the Ashen Capital, the version of Leyndell that exists after the Erdtree's fire, after the burning that the main quest required, Godfrey returned, the first Elden Lord, who had been exiled long before the Shattering, who had been building toward his own return through the wandering warrior years, came back to Leyndell in time to find his son. Morgott was in his final moments when Godfrey arrived. The first Elden Lord cradled him tenderly as Morgott's body crumbled into golden dust. The father, who had been exiled before Morgott was born, returned to hold him at his death. Godfrey had not been present for Morgott's childhood, had not been there when the twins were sent underground, had not been there through the years of imprisonment, had not been there for the defense of Leyndell or the governance of the city from concealment. He arrived at the end. Whether this was comfort or additional tragedy, the father appearing at the final moment, rather than any of the moments before it, depends on how you interpret what Godfrey's return represented. The reunion at death was real. The decades of absence before it were also real. Morgott became golden dust. The body that had been an embarrassment to the Golden Order, the Omen nature, the horns, the crucible blood, dissolved into the same golden material that the Golden Order had organized its entire aesthetic around. The cursed body, at its dissolution, was the same color as grace. Sleep well. 4 more parts remain, and the Shunning-Grounds still has more to reveal. Morgott's story is not simply a personal tragedy. It is a document of institutional failure, a record of what happens when a religious and social system builds its authority around claims that its own foundational history contradicts. The Golden Order's treatment of the Omen was one of the clearest expressions of this failure, and Morgott was the clearest expression of everything that failure cost. Tonight, we sit with the theology itself. What the Golden Order claimed about grace, about worth, about the proper order of being, and what Morgott's existence revealed about the gap between those claims and the reality they were supposed to describe. The theology of the Golden Order was organized around a single central premise. Grace was real, grace was given by the Erdtree, and grace was the measure of a being standing in the divine order, those who had grace shone with it. The golden light that the game's visual language consistently associated with the Erdtree's favor, with divine approval, with the hierarchy that Marika's order had established. Those without grace were lesser. Their absence of the golden light was evidence of their diminished standing. The Omen were the most visible category of the graceless. Their animal features, the horns, the tails, the crucible's expression in their bodies, were classified as evidence that the Erdtree's grace had not touched them, that they existed outside the framework the Golden Order had built. Their exclusion from grace was visible, documented in their bodies, used as justification for every harm the Golden Order's institutions did to them. This framework required that grace and worth track each other reliably. A being with grace had the Erdtree's approval. A being without grace had demonstrated something about their standing. The framework was self-reinforcing. Grace justified treatment. Treatment confirmed the framework. The framework justified grace. Where the framework failed, Morgott's great rune was the anchor. This single fact broke the framework open. The great rune, the divine instrument that the Elden Ring's shattering had distributed into the demigod's hands, was the most direct possible expression of the Erdtree's divine structure. It was not an institution's opinion about worth. It was the Elden Ring itself, the governing mechanism of the lands between spiritual life, registering what was true about the being who held it. The Elden Ring gave its anchor to an omen, the base of its structure, the ring that housed the foundation, was held by the demigod that the Golden Order's institutions had imprisoned underground, because his omen nature was evidence of divine disfavor. The Golden Order claimed that Omen had no grace. The divine instrument chose an omen to hold its most fundamental piece. The institution's theology and the divine reality it claimed to represent were in direct contradiction, and Morgott's great rune was the evidence. This was not a subtle discrepancy. The anchor ring's description explicitly names both facts, the golden lineage and the Lord of Leyndell, precisely because the Golden Order's institutions had denied both. The Great Rune was correcting the record in the language that the Golden Order claimed to respect above all others, the language of the Elden Ring itself. The Golden Order built its hierarchy around who had grace. The Elden Ring gave its anchor to the being the hierarchy had most comprehensively rejected. Either the Golden Order had been wrong about what grace meant, or it had been right about what grace meant and wrong about Morgott, or the entire framework of using grace to justify hierarchies of worth was more fragile than the institution had wanted to acknowledge. The Crucible and what it meant. The Omen's connection to the Crucible was central to the Golden Order's rejection of them, and it was also, under examination, one of the most revealing aspects of the Theology's internal contradictions. The Crucible was the primordial state, the mixing of all natures that had characterized the world before the Erdtree's dominance organized existence into separate categories. The Crucible incantations that the game preserves describe what this state produced. The expression of animal nature in human bodies, the co-mingling of what would later be separated, the generative mixing that the Golden Order had classified as chaotic and therefore subordinate to the organized world the Erdtree had produced. The Crucible was older than the Golden Order. This was the fact that the Golden Order found most uncomfortable to acknowledge. The Erdtree had not always been the organizing principle of the lands between. Before the Erdtree, before Marika, before the Golden Order, the Crucible had been the form that existence took. The Omen's features were not evidence of corruption or failure. They were evidence of age, of a connection to a way of existing that predated the current arrangement. The Crucible was not demonic. It was ancient. And what the Golden Order called a curse was, in the longer history of the lands between, simply an older form of life expressing itself. The game's treatment of the Crucible through its incantations is careful on this point. The aspects of the Crucible spells, the Great Tail, the Thorns, the Breath of Fire, are described as primordial arts that predate the Erdtree. They are powerful. They are genuinely ancient. They are not corrupting in the way that the Golden Order's framework implied. They are expressions of what life was before it was organized into the current categories. Morgott's Omen nature was a connection to this older tradition. His horns were not evidence of divine rejection. They were evidence that the Crucible's expression had found its way into the direct lineage of the people who had built the institution that rejected it. This was the part of the contradiction that had the most theological weight. Marika and Godfrey, the founders of the Golden Order's current form, had produced children who expressed the Crucible. The institution that classified Crucible expression as evidence of disfavor had founders whose bloodline produced that expression. The founders were, through their children, connected to the very thing the institution they had built rejected. What grace actually was. The game offers another reading of grace that exists alongside the Golden Order's institutional theology, and this reading changes the framework significantly. Grace, in Elden Ring, is not simply divine favor awarded on merit. It is a call, a guiding light that marks the direction of something important. The Tarnished follow the guidance of grace toward the Elden Ring, because that guidance exists, because something is directing them, because the call is real in a material sense, rather than simply a metaphorical one. The grace that the Golden Order classified as evidence of worth was always more ambiguous than the institution claimed. What shone was not necessarily a mark of personal virtue or divine approval in the moral sense. It was a marker, a light that indicated something about cosmic alignment, about position in a plan that the greater will was expressing through the Erdtree. Morgott's great rune was golden. His body, at dissolution, produced golden dust. The visual language of the Golden Order's grace was present in him at his most fundamental level, in the material of the divine instrument he held, and in the material his body produced when it came apart. The institution had classified him as without grace. The material reality of what he was contradicted this classification at every level. His blood was golden. His great rune was golden. His death produced golden dust. He was golden all the way through, and the institution that classified golden things as graceful had decided he was the exception. The exception was not coherent with the rule. If anything was evidence of the Golden Order's theological claims, Morgott was. If anything invalidated those claims, Morgott was also that. He was the refutation that the institution refused to allow, maintained in underground chains until the chains were no longer enforceable. The institutional betrayal. The personal betrayal of Morgott by the Golden Order is visible and documented in the law. The systemic betrayal, the broader pattern of what the Golden Order did to the Omen, and what the Omen's treatment revealed about the institution, extends beyond Morgott himself into the world the game depicts. The Omen Bairn is an item found throughout the lands between, a preserved infant, small enough to be held, used as a consumable item that calls to distant grace. The item's description explains what an Omen Bairn is. The child of an Omen Mother, removed and preserved, used as a tool. The Omen who gave birth was not acknowledged. The child was taken and given a function in the Golden Order's institutional machinery. The item's existence as something that can be found in multiple locations across the lands. Between documents, how widespread the practice was. Omen Bairns were common enough to be tradable, findable, part of the world's ambient economy. The births that produced them, the Omen women whose children were taken, the scale of the practice. All of this is compressed into the existence of the item as a collectible. This was the world Morgott defended, the institution that produced Omen Bairns as collectibles, the theology that made the removal of Omen children from their mothers a normal enough practice to distribute its products across the lands between. He understood what he was defending. He defended it anyway. What his defense tells us about him is complex enough to resist simple characterization. He was not naive. He was not ignorant of the institution's failures. He had been the victim of those failures in the most direct possible way. Not abstract theological injustice, but the concrete experience of being chained underground because of what the institution decided he was. He found something in the Erdtree worth preserving that he could separate from what the institution had done with it. Whether that separation was possible, whether the Erdtree and the Golden Order were genuinely separable things, or whether defending the Erdtree was necessarily defending everything the Golden Order had built around it, is the question his story poses without resolving. The Forsaken and what they shared. We are all forsaken. Morgott's final words placed him in a category that included everyone. Himself, the other demigods, the Tarnished, all the beings who had pressed toward the Erdtree and found the path closed. The thorns sealed the Erdtree against everyone. Morgott's dedication had not exempted him. The demigods' power had not exempted them. The Tarnished's grace-guided purpose had not yet exempted them. In the period when Morgott spoke those words, the Erdtree was inaccessible to all. This universality is significant. The Forsaking was not selective in the way that the Golden Order's theology claimed grace was selective. The thorns did not evaluate who deserved to pass and turn away those who did not. They closed the path for everyone. The institution that had built a hierarchy around who had grace and who did not encountered, in the thorns, a closing that made no distinctions. Morgott saw this clearly. He had been the most prominent victim of the Golden Order's selective grace theology, had lived his entire life classified as less than what he was. And when he said we are all forsaken, he was acknowledging that the selective theology had been replaced by something total, something that treated all claimants equally by turning all of them away. There was something almost redemptive in the universality of the Forsaking from Morgott's perspective. The institution that had decided he was not worthy of grace had itself been found unworthy by the thorns. The demigods who had been given thrones and grace and recognition were turned away at the same barrier that had always turned him away. In the end, the Forsaking was democratic. He was not celebrating this. He was mourning it. We are all forsaken was not a vindication. It was a grief. He had defended the institution because he believed the Erdtree was worth defending. And now the Erdtree had sealed itself against everyone. What he had been defending had closed the door. But the universality was there. Whatever the Golden Order had claimed about who had grace and who did not, the Erdtree itself had made no such distinction when the time came to close. Everyone was equal before the thorns. The hierarchy of grace had been superseded by something that recognized no hierarchy at all. Sleep well. 3 more parts remain, and the subterranean Shunning-Grounds still holds its secrets. The city of Leyndell was built over something. This is not unusual for cities. Civilizations build on the remains of what came before, on foundations older than the structures above, on the accumulated weight of decisions made across generations. What Leyndell was built over was, in its way, a document of the Golden Order's relationship to everything it could not accommodate. The subterranean Shunning-Grounds, the network of spaces beneath the capital, accessible through entrances hidden in the city's lower districts, descending through layers of architecture that grew older and stranger the deeper one went, was the repository of what the Golden Order had decided the world above should not have to look at directly. Other Omen lived there. after Morgott and Mohg broke free, after the chaos of the shattering produced enough disruption in the systems maintaining the underground's population, others who had been imprisoned there either escaped or were killed in the upheaval. But in the period before the shattering, and in the deep spaces below the Shunning-Grounds themselves, there were things that had been in the underground long enough to have become something other than what they were when they arrived. Tonight we follow the underground, not simply as the place where Morgott grew up, but as the layer of the lands between that the Golden Order's history had produced, and that the Tarnished could descend into to understand what had been built above by examining what had been pushed below. The architecture of exclusion. The subterranean Shunning-Grounds were not designed as a prison in the formal sense. They did not have cells arranged in rows or wardrooms for guards, or the bureaucratic infrastructure of an institution built around managing prisoners. They were more like a disposal, a space that received what the city above could not accommodate, and held it without particular attention to what happened next. The Omen who were sent there were sent, and then the sending was essentially the end of the institution's involvement. The underground was not supervised. It was not managed. The Omen who survived there survived through whatever combination of their own capability and the underground's resources allowed, and the Golden Order above did not monitor what that survival looked like. This indifference was its own statement. The Golden Order's treatment of the Omen was not organized cruelty. It was organized indifference, which in practice produced similar outcomes. The Omen children of noble families were imprisoned underground and then forgotten. What became of them? There was not a matter that the institution tracked or cared about. They had been removed from the visible world, and the removal was the point. Morgott and Mohg grew in this indifference. The years they spent underground before their paths diverged were years spent in a space that the Golden Order had created but was not attending to. Whatever development they underwent, whatever theological convictions they formed, whatever relationship to power and to their own nature they developed, was formed without interference from the institution that had put them there. The freedom of the forgotten. They were imprisoned, but the imprisonment was not supervised closely enough to prevent the growth that produced what they became. Mohg's communion with the Formless Mother happened in the depths of the underground, without the Golden Order's knowledge. Morgott's development of the theology that led him to defend the Erdtree happened in the underground's darkness, without anyone monitoring what conclusions he was reaching. The institution put them underground, and left them to become whatever the underground would make them. The underground made one of them the Omen King, who defended Leyndell, and one of them the Lord of Blood, who built a dynasty in opposition to everything Leyndell represented. The deeper depths. The subterranean Shunning-Grounds descended further than the level where the Omen were kept, below the level of the imprisoned noble Omen, below the architecture of the underground prison that the Golden Order's management had built. There were older spaces, the Forsaken Depths, the designation given to the lowest accessible area of the underground network, where the environment shifted from the constructed spaces of the Shunning-Grounds into something that had a different quality. Older, less shaped by deliberate architecture, more expressive of whatever had been in these spaces before Leyndell was built above them. Mohg had gone this deep. The communion with the Formless Mother that had transformed Mohg's accursed blood into the blood flame power of his dynasty had happened somewhere in these depths, in the space below the prison that the Golden Order had built. The outer god that Mohg found was not something the Golden Order had placed there. It was something the underground had always contained, something that predated the city above and the institution the city housed. The Erdtree's roots reach down here. In the deepest spaces of the underground, the enormous root system of the Erdtree, the physical infrastructure of the divine presence that Marika had established at the center of the lands between, was visible. The tree that organized the world above had its physical foundation in the depths below, and those depths were the same depths that had held the Omen underground, and that had held the Formless Mother even further below. The Erdtree's roots and the outer god of blood in the same underground, the divine structure of the Golden Order and the thing that had given Mohg his power, occupying the same geological space. The institution above had built itself around the Erdtree without knowing, or without acknowledging, what the Erdtree's roots descended into, what the frenzied flame concealed. The deepest level of the Shunning-Grounds descent led to something that the surface had no knowledge of, and that the underground was organized without explicit design to keep concealed. The frenzied flame prescription, the door at the bottom, an enormous sealed entrance barred against opening by everything the frenzied flame's lore described as the most complete concealment available. What was behind it was not something the underground had been built to contain. It was something the underground had been built above without the builders knowing what they were building over. The three fingers. Below the Shunning-Grounds, below the forsaken depths, below everything the Golden Order had put underground, the entity associated with the frenzied flame waited. The counterpart to the two fingers that served as the Greater Will's intermediaries, the three fingers represented something the Greater Will's institutional framework had defined itself against. The flame of frenzy, the burning that would equalize all things by burning all things. The tarnished who descended to the bottom of the subterranean Shunning-Grounds and removed their armor before the great door. The ritual the law required for what came next, received the frenzied flame's brand. They became the vessel for the burning that the Golden Order's entire existence had been organized to prevent. This was beneath Leyndell, beneath the city that Morgott had defended, below the Golden Order's capital, below the architecture of grace and worth and divine hierarchy. The flame that would end the entire framework waited in the dark. The Golden Order had built its center over the thing that could erase the center. This was either profound cosmic irony or the lands between's most significant piece of unintentional symbolism. The institution of grace housing in its foundations, the force that recognized no grace at all. Morgott did not know about the three fingers. There is no indication in the lore that the veiled monarch who governed Leyndell from concealment had descended to the deepest spaces below his city and found what was there. He defended the Erdtree without knowing that the Erdtree city sat above the frenzied flame, or perhaps he did know, and the knowledge was part of what gave his defense its particular gravity. The awareness that what he was defending was more fragile than it claimed, that the institution's foundations were older and stranger than its theology acknowledged, that grace and the absence of grace were not as cleanly separated as the Golden Order required them to be. The law does not say. It presents the geography and leaves the interpretation open. The Omen community below. In the space of the Shunning-Grounds accessible to the Tarnished during the main game, the population of Omen who had been sent underground was visible. They were hostile. The Omen that the Tarnished encountered in the Shunning-Grounds attacked on sight, not because they were monsters, but because the underground's conditions had produced the behavior that generations of imprisonment and abandonment produce. They were beings who had been put somewhere by an institution that did not care what happened to them next. And what had happened to them next was that they had been in the dark for a long time, with other beings in similar conditions, without resources from above, without the acknowledgement from above that might have produced different behaviours. The hostility of the Shunning-Grounds population was the predictable outcome of the treatment that had placed them there. The Golden Order classified Omen as dangerous. The conditions the Golden Order created for Omen produced the danger the Golden Order claimed had required those conditions in the first place. This circular logic, the institution creating the conditions that appeared to justify the institution's claims, was the most compact expression of how the Golden Order's treatment of the Omen worked. The Theology said the Omen were without grace. The treatment that followed from this classification produced beings who expressed what the institution called graceless behavior. The expression of graceless behavior was cited as evidence of the original theological claim. The circle completed. The Omen in the Shunning-Grounds were evidence of what long-term institutional abandonment produced. They were also evidence of what the Golden Order had done to people by deciding their existence was inconvenient before they were old enough to have done anything. The perfumers and their attempts. The law preserves a record of one group that had tried to address the Omen's condition through medical means. The perfumers, practitioners of a tradition that combined aromatic compounds with healing effects, had attempted to develop treatments for the Omen condition. The regal Omen Bairn description mentions that perfumers attempted to use aromatic compounds to suppress the Omen's animal traits. The attempt was unsuccessful in curing anything. The Omen condition was not something that aromatic treatment could address at its source, but the attempt had been made, documented, and preserved in the item descriptions that the game distributed across the lands between. What the perfumer's attempt revealed was that there had been people within the lands between who understood the Omen's condition as something to be addressed, rather than simply managed through exclusion. The suppression of animal traits was still organized around the Golden Order's framework. The assumption that the Omen's features were the problem, that normalizing the body would address the condition. But the intention was toward remedy, rather than imprisonment. The attempts failed. The Omen remained Omen. The perfumer's tradition moved on to other applications, and the aromatic treatments that had not worked for the Omen's animal features found other uses in the land's between's ecology of healing and enhancement. What the failed attempts documented. The Omen condition was not addressable through the methods available within the Golden Order's framework. The framework that had classified the condition as a curse was also the framework that limited what remedies were pursued. A system that understood the Omen's features as divine punishment was not going to develop the theological framework for understanding those features as simply an older form of expression that required no remedy. Morgott's solution, the sealing of the curse within the warped blade, was the most sophisticated response to the Omen condition that the law documented. He had not cured himself. He had found a way to manage the expression of what he was, to present differently when the situation required it, to contain the Omen nature in a form that allowed the normalized presentation without eliminating the source. It was a solution built entirely from within himself, without institutional support, developed in the underground years when no one was paying attention to what conclusions the imprisoned Omen twins were reaching. Morgott's relationship to the underground. After he broke free from the Shunning-Grounds and began governing Leyndell, Morgott maintained a connection to the underground. The subterranean Shunning-Grounds were part of Leyndell's infrastructure, beneath the city he was governing, accessible through the same city, and as the Veiled Monarch, he had authority over everything within Leyndell's boundaries. Whether he ever returned to the underground, whether the Omen King who had grown up below ever went back to see what remained of the place that had shaped him, the law does not confirm. His primary presence was in the city above, in the throne room, in the nighttime operations of the Knights' Cavalry. The underground had been his home for the years before the Shattering, and after the Shattering, it was part of the city he governed. The continuity between his origin and his governance is one of the quiet ironies of his story. The Omen who had been put underground was now the authority over the world that extended from the underground to the Erdtree's heights. He had not escaped the underground so much as he had expanded his domain to include both the underground and the city above it, governing both from a position that acknowledged neither his origin nor the underground's existence to the population he served. The city continued not knowing. The underground continued existing. Morgott governed both as the veiled monarch whose real identity remained concealed from the people he protected, defending a system that maintained his origin's darkness as the unacknowledged foundation of its golden surface. Sleep well. 2 more parts remain, and the final question of what Morgott means is waiting. The character that most players of Elden Ring meet first is Margit, not Morgott. The fell omen on the bridge to Stormveil Castle. The gnarled, ancient figure with the staff and the golden swords, and the dialogue that frames the Tarnished's ambition as something to be turned back rather than encouraged, is the introduction to what will eventually be understood as a single character wearing 2 faces. This structure was deliberate, from Software's design choice to present Morgott first as Margit, to let the player develop a relationship with the disguised identity before revealing the person beneath it, was not simply a narrative twist for its own sake. It was a way to make visible something about how concealed identities work, how a person who hides what they are presents a version of themselves to the world that the world then forms judgments about, without those judgments reaching the actual person doing the hiding. Margit is how Morgott wanted to be seen by the world he was protecting. Morgott is what he actually was. The gap between those 2 things, what the fell Omen persona communicated and what the Omen King's reality contained, is worth examining carefully, because the gap tells us more about Morgott than either identity does alone. What Margit communicated. The fell Omen persona was constructed with clear intentions. Margit was ancient seeming, older in appearance than the other demigods, marked by the visual language of age and wear in a way that suggested vast experience rather than simply power. The staff, the worn appearance, the verbal style of someone who had been watching ambitious claimants for a very long time and found them all wanting. These were choices in how Morgott chose to present the gatekeeper function he was performing. Margit was contemptuous. Not the contempt of someone who hated the Tarnished or wished them harm, but the contempt of someone who had seen many versions of this before and expected the current version to end the same way. The language, fool, lowly, brash ambition, was the language of someone who classified what they were seeing as a familiar type rather than a unique individual. The Tarnished were not, to Margit, persons with their own stories and their own reasons for pressing toward the Elden Ring. They were the latest instance of the category. Ambitious claimant. This was a performance of Golden Order values by someone who had been excluded from those values. Margit upheld the hierarchy that classified the Tarnished's ambition as overreach, the same hierarchy that had classified Morgott's birth as a curse. He was enforcing the framework from the outside while living outside it himself. The concealment went beyond simply hiding his horns. Margit's personality, the ancient weariness, the contempt, the framing of everything in terms of the Golden Order's standards, was not straightforwardly Morgott's personality. Morgott, as revealed in the throne room confrontation, was someone in genuine grief. His final words were not contemptuous, they were sorrowful. The acknowledgement that they were all forsaken, that his deeds had been met with failure just as the tarnished's would be, was the statement of a person in mourning for something he had loved and lost. Margit's contempt and Morgott's grief were both expressions of the same underlying experience, the experience of someone who had dedicated everything to a cause that had not acknowledged the dedication. But they were different registers of response. Margit presented the response as superiority, a being who had figured out that ambition led nowhere and was now informing the ambitious of this fact. Morgott expressed the response as grief, a being who had lived the lesson and was sharing it from inside the loss. The disguise was not simply physical, it was emotional. The Margit persona allowed Morgott to maintain distance from the sorrow that governed his actual relationship to what he was doing. As Margit, the futility of the tarnished's ambition was something to be named and dismissed from a position of detached authority. As Morgott, the futility was something he had experienced himself from within, without the distance. What the Fell Omen title meant, Margit was called the Fell Omen. This title deserves attention. Fell, in the context of Elden Ring's language, was consistently used to mean terrible, dreadful, or evil, a descriptor of something that carried an aura of doom or malevolence. Fell Omen placed two words together that both carried negative connotations, the fell of terrible things and the omen of cursed beings. The title described Margit as doubly bad, terrible in himself and cursed in his nature. Morgott chose this title for his disguise. He named the persona he presented to the world with a description that fully embraced the worst the Golden Order would say about what he was. He was an omen, and he was fell. And the disguise wore those descriptions openly, while the actual person beneath the disguise wore them as the definition of his existence's central tension. The choice to call the persona the Fell Omen was either a kind of self-aware dark humour, Morgott naming his disguise after the worst things the world said about his kind, or it was something more complicated. Perhaps the name was honest in a way the disguise otherwise was not. Margit was called what Morgott believed the world saw when it saw an omen. Something fell, something cursed, something that carried its damnation in its blood. If this reading is right, then Morgott's disguise was built around a painful internalization of the Golden Order's worst assessments of his kind. He put on the face the world expected of an omen, fell, dangerous, to be turned back, and used that face to protect the world from threats, while the actual Morgott, who loved the Erdtree and had dedicated his existence to its defense, stayed hidden beneath it. The psychological complexity of this arrangement was immense. A being who loved something wearing the costume of the thing he was supposed to be, the dangerous omen, the fell creature, in order to perform a service for the beloved thing, while the beloved thing's institutional framework continued to classify his existence as a curse. The Knights Cavalry's role in the persona. The Knights Cavalry were Margit's, more than they were Morgott's. The Order rode at night, under the authority of the Veiled Monarch, hunting the ambitious and preserving the stability that Morgott was maintaining. But their operational identity was tied to the same darkness that Margit inhabited. The Knights Cavalry armor sets, found at various locations across the lands between, described warriors who served the order of an unknown lord, operating in the hours when the Golden Order's light did not reach. They were the institutional expression of Morgott's double life, an organization that served his purposes without being traceable to him as Morgott. Only to the Veiled Monarch whose real identity was never confirmed for the public he protected. The Knights Cavalry encountered by the Tarnished throughout the lands between, the mounted figures that appeared at night on the roads of various regions, riding their ghost horses, wielding their characteristic weapons, were the remnants of this order still operating after Morgott's death. The institution he had built outlasted him, at least in its operational presence. The Knights Cavalry continued riding the roads of the lands between even after the Omen King, who had founded them, was gone. This persistence was a kind of unintentional monument. Morgott's death had not ended the order he had built. The riders who served the Veiled Monarch's authority were still out, still hunting the ambitious, still performing the function he had designed for them. The institution continued without the architect. The Tarnished who encountered Knights Cavalry members after Morgott's defeat were encountering the echo of his governance. The institutional machinery still running after the hand that had built it had dissolved into golden dust. It was one of the more poignant expressions in Elden Ring of how institutions outlast the people who create them, for better or worse. The contrast of styles. Margit fought with a staff and manifested golden weapons. Morgott fought with the warped blade of sealed blood and manifested the same golden weapons through different means. The fighting styles shared elements. Both drew on the Golden Order's sacred arms. Both deployed the holy weapons that expressed connection to the divine tradition Morgott was serving. But the differences documented what each identity was expressing. Margit's staff was the concealment's instrument as well as its weapon. The wooden staff that housed the warped blade was both a disguise and a genuine fighting tool. It served the double function that Morgott's entire double life served. The staff looked ordinary. It was not. What it concealed was the most dangerous thing about its wielder. Morgott's warped blade, released when the concealment was abandoned, was the Omen nature expressing itself without the filter of the Margit persona. The blade's appearance, warped, strange, shimming in a way that suggested the Crucible's influence, was the visual language of the curse that the Golden Order classified as evidence of disfavor. In the boss fight's second phase, when Morgott released the seal and fought with his full nature, the weapon that emerged was the expression of everything the Golden Order had told him was shameful. He fought with it anyway. The shame was present. The law describes it as unbearable, but he fought with it because the situation required it, because the Tarnished had pressed him far enough that he needed everything he had, because survival and the defense of what he loved required deploying the curse he had spent his life containing. The willingness to use the cursed nature in service of defending the thing that cursed his nature was the most compressed statement of Morgott's entire character. He was Omen. He served the Erdtree. He used the Omen power to defend the Erdtree. The shame of being what he was did not prevent him from using what he was when the defense required it. The question of recognition. Throughout Morgott's double life, the question of recognition hovered. Did anyone know? Did the people of Leyndell suspect that the Veiled Monarch and the Fell Omen were the same being? Did the Knights Cavalry members who served both identities understand they were serving one person? Did any NPC in the game's world acknowledge the connection before the Tarnished discovered it through the boss fight revelation? The lore is largely silent on this. The design of the concealment was careful enough that no character in the game is shown having pieced together the connection before the revelation. The Tarnished's discovery, the moment when the fight with Morgott confirms what the observant player might have suspected from the resemblance to Margit, is presented as a discovery, not a confirmation of something everyone already knew. Melina could be a summon for the Morgott fight. The character who had been guiding the Tarnished throughout their journey who had the most information about the lands between of any companion character, could be called upon to assist in defeating the Omen King. Whether Melina had known about Morgott's double identity before the fight, whether her willingness to assist in his defeat was informed by knowledge about what he was and what he had done, was not confirmed in the available dialogue. The recognition he never received was one of the tragedy's final layers. He governed an empire without acknowledgement. He defended an institution without recognition. He died having been defeated by the Tarnished. His own grace-guided purpose had called back, having been held by a father who had not been present for any of the decades of governance and defense, having acknowledged in his final words that all the forsaking was universal. He had been seen, finally, as what he was, the Omen King, without the Margit disguise, only in the context of a fight he lost. Sleep well. One final part remains, and the meaning of everything is still ahead. Let everything slow. We have followed Morgott from birth in the underground, through the years of imprisonment in the Subterranean Shunning-Grounds, through the development of his sealed curse and his love for the Erdtree, through the governance of Leyndell from behind the veiled monarch's concealment, through the creation of Margit and the Knight's cavalry, through the sustained defense of a city that had no throne for him, to the Elden Throne encounter where the Omen King stood without disguise and fell. Now we step back and ask what the story was, the shape of the tragedy. Morgott's tragedy is not the tragedy of someone who was destroyed by their choices. He made choices, and some of them were limiting. The choice to love the Erdtree, the choice to defend the Golden Order, the choice to conceal his identity rather than confront the institution directly. But these were not the choices that destroyed him. He was not destroyed. He lived a full life, governed an empire, defended what he valued, and died having been held by his father in his final moments. By most measures, his life was more complete than the lives of many of the demigods who surrounded him. What makes his story a tragedy is the asymmetry, the depth of his dedication measured against the absence of anything coming back in return. He gave everything to the Golden Order and received nothing from the Golden Order in return. He held the anchor ring of the Elden Ring and was given no throne. He governed Leyndell and was never publicly acknowledged as its governor. He loved the Erdtree, and the Erdtree turned him away at the thorns along with everyone else. The tragedy is not failure. He did not fail. He succeeded at almost everything he tried to do. He held Leyndell. He filtered the Tarnished through the Margit persona. He maintained the Golden Order's stability in the Shattering's aftermath. He carried the anchor ring that proved his golden lineage. He was extraordinarily capable, and he applied that capability consistently and effectively. The tragedy is that the thing he applied it to was not capable of acknowledging what he was doing for it. The central question his story poses, Morgott's choice to love and defend a system that had wronged him, is the choice that the game asks its players to sit with without resolving. The simplest reading is that he was wrong to make this choice, that the Golden Order did not deserve his loyalty, that his dedication was a form of self-betrayal. An Omen who had internalized his oppressor's framework so thoroughly that he served them even from within the prison they had built for him. That the shame he felt at deploying his Omen nature was the Golden Order's most complete victory over him. It had not only imprisoned him, it had made him ashamed of the power that imprisonment had given him space to develop. This reading has significant support in the lore. The shame is documented as unbearable. The concealment of his identity was total. His defense of the institution that had wronged him was not accompanied by any visible effort to reform it. He did not use his position as Leyndell's governor to change the treatment of Omen. He defended a system that was still producing Omen bairns while he was defending it. The more generous reading is that Morgott understood something that the simplest reading misses. He had separated the Erdtree from the Golden Order, the divine structure from the human institution built around it, and found something in the Erdtree worth defending that was independent of what the institution had done with it. He loved the Erdtree the way a person loves a tradition that has been corrupted by its current practitioners, not naive about the corruption, but committed to what the tradition was at its best, rather than what it had become in practice. This reading also has support. His words at defeat were not the words of someone who had been naive about the system he served. They were the words of someone who had known all along, who had been in it from inside, who had lived the failure personally, and who had chosen to serve anyway. The we are all forsaken acknowledged what the law suggested he had always known. The Erdtree was not going to return what he gave it. He had given it anyway. Both readings can be true simultaneously. He was both the victim of a harmful internalization and the practitioner of a form of love that transcended what he was owed. He was both wrong and heroic. He was both the Golden Order's most devoted servant and its most devastating indictment. What he said to the Tarnished. His final dialogue with the Tarnished, the acknowledgement of the forsaking, the warning that their deeds would be met with failure just as his had been, was an act of genuine communication. He had been performing a role for the entire game. Margit had performed contempt. Morgott in the throne room opening had performed the Golden Order's language of hierarchy and worth. But at defeat, the performance ended. The man who had been behind all of it, behind the disguise and the governance and the throne room posturing, spoke. He did not curse the Tarnished. He did not insist on the justice of his cause. He did not perform the dignity of an undefeated ideal. He acknowledged the shared condition. We are all forsaken, and offered the only thing that his experience of the forsaking gave him to offer, the knowledge of what lay ahead. This was a kind of gift. Morgott's warning about the thorns, about the Erdtree's closure, about the difficulty of the path ahead, was information born from his own attempt to walk that path. He had tried. He knew what happened when you tried. He told the Tarnished what he knew. The Tarnished pressed on. They found the thorns, as Morgott had told them they would, and then they found the way through. The path that Morgott had not found, the approach that his dedication to the existing structure had not led him to. The Tarnished succeeded where Morgott had failed, not because they were stronger or more deserving, but because they came from outside the Golden Order's framework and were therefore able to approach the problem without the constraints that framework imposed. Morgott had been too loyal to the structure to find the way around the structure. His love for the Erdtree had been expressed through the Golden Order's institutional channels, and those channels led to the thorns. The Tarnished, with less investment in the institutional channels, found other paths. His warning was accurate, and his conclusion was wrong. The Tarnished's deeds were not met with failure, as his had been. They succeeded. The failure Morgott had experienced was not universal. It was the failure of a particular approach, the approach organized around the Golden Order's institutional framework. He had thought it was the only approach. He had been wrong about this, and his being wrong about it was connected to the same devotion that had made him who he was. Godfrey at the end. The father who cradled him at his death deserves its own consideration. Godfrey had been exiled from the lands between, before the shattering, before the twins were sent to the Shunning-Grounds, before anything that defined Morgott's life had happened. He had not been present for any of it. He was present at the end, the tenderness the lore describes. Godfrey cradling Morgott's diminishing body, the first Elden Lord who had been a warrior of extraordinary capability, reduced in his final return to holding his dying son, was the reunion of two people who had been separated by the structures of the world for Morgott's entire life. Whether Godfrey knew what Morgott had done, whether the father who arrived at the Ashen capital had been told about the decades of governance, the defense of Leyndell, the Knights' Cavalry, the Omen King who had held the city for a cause neither of them had been fully accepted by. The game does not confirm. He arrived. He held his son. Morgott became golden dust in his arms. The golden dust. The image is worth sitting with. The body that the Golden Order had classified as cursed. The Omen body with its horns and its crucible blood and its unbearable shame. Dissolved at its end into the same golden material that the Golden Order associated with grace, with worth, with the Erdtree's favour. The curse became grace at its dissolution, or the grace had always been there, inside the curse, and the dissolution was the only moment when the two were visible as the same thing. The Golden Order classified them as opposites. In the material of Morgott's death, they were identical. One final image, the throne room in Leyndell, the space where every demigod but Morgott and Mohg had seats. The place Morgott had governed from without acknowledgement, had defended against every challenger, had waited in for the Tarnished who would finally arrive strong enough to reach him. Empty now. The demigods whose thrones filled the room were gone, scattered by the shattering, defeated by the Tarnished, consumed by their own catastrophes. The thrones remained. The empty seats, arranged in the golden space of the Golden Order's most formal chamber, held the memory of the hierarchy they had been built for. The spaces where Morgott and Mohg's thrones should have been were still absent. Even in the empty room, even with the governance structure collapsed and the shattering's aftermath having stripped meaning from most of what the room had represented, the absence of the Omen twins' seats was still there. The room had been built without them, and it remained built without them, even after everyone who had built it was gone. Morgott had sat on the Elden Throne anyway, the throne at the centre, the seat of the Elden Lord, the place that becoming Elden Lord would have meant occupying, had been where Morgott waited for the Tarnished. He had sat there without being acknowledged as its occupant, without the recognition that sitting there would have meant under different circumstances. He had been the last king, the last coherent governing authority in Leyndell's final age. He had called himself king in his last words, felled by King Morgott, last of all kings, the title that the lore preserved as the expression of what he claimed for himself at the end. He was right. He was the last king. After him, the Tarnished moved on toward the Erdtree, and whatever came after was not a king, but something else. Elden Lord, or the Age of Stars consort, or the Frenzied Flames vessel, or whatever other ending the Tarnished chose. The Age of Kings, of the governance structure that the Golden Order had built, ended with Morgott, with the last of all kings had no throne. He governed from concealment. He loved what never acknowledged him. He dissolved into golden dust held by a father who arrived at the end of everything. He had kept the anchor of everything the shattering had scattered, of all the great runes that had gone to all the claimants. The one that held the foundation had been his. He held it for the Erdtree, for the institution that had put him underground, for the divine structure he had separated from the human failures of its administrators and found worth defending. He held it until the end. This has been the entire Morgott and the Omens timeline. from the birth that was classified as a curse before a choice had been made, through the underground years and the sealed curse and the double life and the governance from behind the golden disguise, through the last stand in the throne room that had no seat for him, to the golden dust in his father's arms, told slowly, over 8 nights, 8, for the quiet between waking and the Erdtree's distant light, the last of all kings, still golden at the end. Good night, my dear friend.